So welcome to everybody who's joining us tonight. We're just waiting for people to be admitted. We've got lots of people lined up in our waiting room that we're frantically admitting just to make sure you can all get in for 7:30. Well, it's just gone 7:30. So we'll just wait a little bit longer to get as many people in as we can. Okay, so hello, good evening, everybody. I'm Rebecca Taylor, the editor of Jewish Renaissance magazine. Welcome to our event tonight, which will be looking at the history and significance of European country houses that were built by or owned by Jews. So we're going to be joined by Juliet Carey and Abigail Green, who are the editors of a recently published landmark book called Jewish Country Houses, and I'll be introducing them more fully in a minute. But first, just to give you a little bit of background to the subject tonight, if you've ever watched Downton Abbey or seen or read Brideshead Revisited, you'll be familiar with the tradition of the country estates that make up such an important part of English culture. Some of England's most magnificent stately homes were built by or owned by Jews. You might have visited Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild's Buckinghamshire home of Waddesdon Manor, or explored Benjamin Disraeli's country base at Hughenden Manor. But what has been particularly exciting for me, having looked at Juliet and Abigail's book, is that it casts its net well beyond England, right across Europe, and even to America, to explore how and why this symbol of wealth and status was embraced by wealthy Jewish families. I have to say, it also features some stunning photos, which I think we'll be seeing more of tonight, by the photographer Elaine Binet. And if you haven't seen the book, I highly recommend you seeing it and buying it. We can put details on the chat for the full name and publisher and where to get it. So to hear more about this fascinating subject, I'm going to hand over now to Juliet Carey and Abigail Green. So Juliet is the senior curator at Waddesdon Manor. She's also worked at the National Gallery in London, the National Gallery Cardiff, and the Royal Collection, and has published on subjects including Elizabethan portraits, 18th century drawings, and the history of collecting. This year, she is curating two exhibitions at Waddesdon. The first, Exploring Jewish Country Houses, photographs by Elaine Binet, opens on March the 26th. The other, Pablo Bronstein, The Temple of Solomon and its Contents, opens in July. Abigail Green is Professor of Modern European History at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Brasenose College. She leads the Jewish Country Houses project based in Oxford and is the author of the award-winning book Moses Montefiore, Jewish Liberator, Imperial Hero, published by Belknap Press in 2010, and of Fatherlands, State Building and Nationhood in 19th Century Germany, published by Cambridge University Press in 2001. So let's go over now to our two experts on this subject, Juliet and Abigail. And
thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just check? Can you see this, the shared screen?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Sorry, Abigail.
Sorry. So I want to thank you very much for that kind introduction. I mean, I'm very well aware that Jewish Renaissance has really embraced the Jewish Country Houses project. You led some tours last year, and so it's a particular pleasure to talk to this audience. And as you can probably tell, this is a book that was born between Waddesdon, where Juliet is senior curator, and Oxford, where I work. But for both of us, for different reasons, I think it's fair to say that it's also a project which speaks the things which are important to us and which we were perhaps only vaguely aware of as we grew up in households that mixed Jewishness, Englishness, Europe, and art in different ways. At the same time, The book is the outcome of a large-scale collaborative research project based at Oxford and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, Oxford itself, and the National Trusts. If you bother to count, you'll find it's a book with no less than 17 authors, each chapter animated not just by a different house, by a different voice. In this way, it captures some of the spirit of the conferences we held along the way within the framework of our academic project, but also, I think, the spirit of conversation that animated so many of these houses, which were, of course, sites of lavish entertaining. And that's a reason why it would have been a particular pleasure to make this presentation with Lucy Wassensteiner, who has written one of the most beautiful and moving chapters in the book. But unfortunately, she is not with us because she's unwell. So you'll have to make do with us. And I understand that this session has been billed about European country houses. And of course, we will talk about Europe. But one of the qualities of our book is that we do not, we see Britain as being part of Europe, and we bring the history of the English country house into Europe. And so in this talk too, we will start in Britain, and then we will take the story of the country house across the Channel and even across the Atlantic. And we hope very much that either listening to us or even buying and reading the book, you'll be inspired to visit some of these houses, which are very moving sites of Jewish memory. Juliet.
Thank you. I have always been suspicious of the cult of the country house, a particularly English phenomenon, though it is endlessly fascinating, and many, myself included, are beguiled by the comforting, nostalgic idea, in many ways a complete fiction, of the real country house. This is Chatsworth, so intimately tied to a particular locality and community that it seems to grow organically out of the landscape, about rootedness, continuity, and paternalism, about national identity and belonging. Our book challenges this with stories of houses owned, built, or renewed by Jews, which tell a more complex story of mobility, of emigration and arrival, prejudice and integration, difference and connection. Houses and families that span and connect across the whole of Europe and beyond. The book consciously plays with the tradition of the country house book. It's not a celebratory coffee table book, treasures of somewhere, the magnificence of some dynasty. In some ways, it is in the tradition of Marc Girouard's groundbreaking social history of country houses, Life in the English Country House, which came out in 1978. And we use the proportions of Marc Girouard's Life in the French Country House of 2000 as the basis of the shape of our book. But its exact form was dictated by the dimensions of Hélène Binet's photographs. And this is one of her photographs of Nymans in Sussex. These marvelous photographs challenge many conventions of country house photography. This slide shows some of a literal suitcase full of country house books that we took to Abigail's literary agent when we first pitched the book, what we wanted our book not to be like. For example, those familiar covers with a splendid edifice across the middle in beige or grey, with a green sward below and blue sky above. So we commissioned Hélène, one of the world's leading photographers, to photograph some of the houses in the book. This is Nymans again, and they are not illustrations to the text, but form a narrative in their own right. Hélène selected them for the book and grouped them, often in surprising and very telling pairs, and her photographs give the book its visual rhythm. They immerse us in and lead us through spaces. Sometimes they give us pause. They are full of the movement of the seasons. This is the Villa Liebermann looking out onto the very modern garden. They tease out unexpected connections between houses. This is Waddesdon on the left and the Villa Liebermann again on the right. They tell us so much about being in this space, and they hold many layers of human experience, even though not one of the photographs has people in it. This is the Villa Tugendhat. They are about loss, as well as about life. This is Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, the house I know best, and one of the most visited of National Trust houses. Here it is seen through Hélène's lens. It's a Victorian hotel of a house that looks from the outside like a French Renaissance chateau, and inside is stuffed full of architectural elements from real French 18th century buildings and works of art, notably the English portraits, French decorative arts, and the kind of medieval and Renaissance treasure cabinet wonders, particularly associated with German taste. Waddesdon was built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, as Rebecca mentioned at the beginning, of the Austrian branch of the banking family, born in Paris, raised in Frankfurt and Vienna, who settled and married in England. He built the house as a stage for his art collection, a setting for lavish entertaining, and a launch pad for a political career. Through the careful integration of architecture and works of art, through which he played with the past and with his complex cultural identity, Ferdinand fashioned himself as a modern collector, you see here on the left, and as a pan-European Renaissance prince, here dressed up for the Devonshire House ball. Abigail.
I'm going to set Waddesdon against a house you may know, but certainly one that is less celebrated. Eastcliff Lodge, home of Sir Moses Montefiore on the outskirts of Ramsgate, here rather romanticised by Turner, who painted it in the 1790s. Superficially, this site seems to tell a very different story. Eastcliff wasn't a bling French-style chateau, but an early example of neo-Gothic English architecture. The house was destroyed, but its early glass houses remain, as does the synagogue, which recalls a Regency townhouse that you see it on the right and on the left with, I think the marble interior is a bit later. The Lady Judith Montefiore Theological College, now lost, looked a lot like other red brick Victorian institutions of higher education. And here you can see a rare photograph of the complete complex taken by the Jewish photographer John Twyman, who lived in Ramsgate. And you can see how the theological college swept into the synagogue and the little mausoleum next door to it. This, I think, does feel foreign. It's modelled on the tomb of Rachel near Bethlehem. And here you see the interior. So Ramsgate is a place which feels unapologetically Jewish, in contrast to Waddesdon, which Jewish visitors often read as a site of assimilation. And importantly, Eastcliff Lodge was both publicly and privately Jewish. Images of the Montefiore sukkah were disseminated in the illustrated press, as you see here. But if we think more deeply about these two houses, we can see they share a common history because they belonged to families that were related and because they were both, in very different ways, Jewish homes. As rich Jews, their owners occupied a particular place in British, European and Jewish society. The Rothschilds and the Montefiores were lay leaders of the Jewish community. They engaged in international Jewish philanthropy. They moved in aristocratic circles, Baron Ferdinand, Sir Moses, and figured in anti-Semitic cartoons like this one, which I think probably dates from the 1840s or even later. Here you see the Jews, an anti-national element, conspiring at a key moment in the struggle against Napoleon to drug the king's messenger so they can make a killing to the public's disadvantage. And we can set that perhaps against this, the frontispiece to W.T. Stead's nasty Christmas novella, The Splendid Paupers, which is centrally preoccupied with the theme of Jews buying up the great castles and estates of Britain. I hope the point is clear. We aren't attempting to create a typology of Jewish country houses, nor to identify a particular style of country house that was in some way Jewish. Instead, we argue that the Jewishness of these houses is relational. It's about the relationship of their owners to non-Jewish society, which was distinctive. And it's about the relationship of their owners to Jewish society, which was distinctive as well. Let me elaborate. All religious minorities experienced inequality in Europe, but the position of Jews as a pan-European non-Christian minority was exceptional. Perhaps in the Netherlands, Jewish settlement and land ownership was less unconstrained and uncontroversial, but by and large, well into the 19th century, Jews across Europe were precluded from owning real estate except in very rare and anomalous situations. In Italy, for example, most Jews were still confined to urban ghettos, just as they were in Central European cities like Frankfurt and Prague. Elsewhere, from Alsace-Lorraine across to Russia, Jewish residents remained contingent, sometimes permitted, always highly regulated, and often prohibited altogether. We often forget that in Britain, too, the right of Jews to own freehold property was uncertain before 1831 and perhaps even until 1846. And this is a way in which we write the story of British Jews and European Jews together. So in retrospect, these constraints on Jewish property ownership may appear a minor matter, but to contemporaries they were no such thing because in 18th and 19th century Britain, citizenship, political rights and property ownership went hand in hand. Two of the houses in our book tell that British story. So if Hughenden is a National Trust property, that's because Disraeli has been for so long a household name, the father of one nation conservatism and Britain's first Jewish and only Jewish prime minister, except he wasn't quite that. Because Disraeli's father Isaac, a literary man who rented a gracious Queen Anne house close to Hughenden, fell out with his synagogue Bevis Marks over a trivial financial matter. Benjamin was baptized at the age when he should have become bar mitzvah. Had he remained Jewish, he could never have become an MP, let alone leader of a rump Tory party. So for a Tory politician, Disraeli's background was eccentric. He was permanently broke and likely entered Parliament to begin with to avoid a debtor's prison. But as Tory leader, he could not operate without a country house, so the party grandees clubbed together to help him buy one. Disraeli became the most powerful man in Britain. Yet no one, not Victoria, who adored him, nor Bismarck, with whom he famously negotiated, forgot for a moment that he was a Jew. Der alte Jude, das ist der Mann, is what Bismarck said about him. The old Jew, that's the man. We find the delicacy of this synthesis preserved at Hughenden, where portraits of Disraeli's Jewish family hang alongside grander paintings of his powerful friends, and in the library, which you can see here, which he inherited from his father. The Salomons estate near Tunbridge Wells, and here you can see an 1868 photograph taken by one of the owners, is a very different proposition. Now a sprawling hotel and events venue, 2 rooms have been preserved as a family shrine. It feels personal, unlike most National Trust properties, and it feels very much more Jewish, with synagogue vestments preserved behind glass and even a treasured fragment of the Kotel, better known as the Wailing Wall. Probably in Jerusalem, probably this audience will know it as the Kotel. So this is a house that tells many stories about men who led public lives and the women who loved, lost, and celebrated them, because it was put together as a collection and a museum by the last daughter of the family. The most prominent story told is that of Sir David Salomons, who you see here, the first Jewish Lord Mayor of London, and one of the heroes of the long battle for Jewish emancipation. And here I think he's painted by Solomon Alexander Hart, who was the first Jewish member of the Royal Academy. Unlike Disraeli, Salomons did not convert. When he was elected to Parliament in the early 1850s, he could not take his seat as an MP, rather like Lionel de Rothschild, because he refused to swear an oath on the true faith of a Christian. But unlike Lionel, he did enter Parliament and become the first Jew to speak in it. You can see the bench from which he was forcibly ejected when he tried to take his seat in the Commons at the Salomons estate. This is, as we explained, not just a British story. We found stories like these all over Europe, and the book tells some of them. Indeed, I would argue that Jewish country houses were as much a hallmark of the age of emancipation as the grand cathedral synagogues that began to appear across Europe in precisely the same period, because both the houses and the synagogues are about Jewish visibility and presence in places where they could not previously be. Let's think for a moment about Lower Austria. Before the Constitution of 1867, Jews had been barred from living in Lower Austria. Some did, but they weren't legally supposed to. 10 years later, the Austrian Rothschilds owned 1/3 of the entire crown land, including massive tracts of forest. This is Schloss Rothschild at Weidhofen an der Ybbs, but actually there were about 40 houses in the surrounding area. So just as the British Rothschilds dominated the Vale of Aylesbury, sometimes known as Rothschildshire, so the Austrian Rothschilds sprinkled this Rothschild Viertel or Rothschild Quarter with their houses. And in due course, this part of Austria became a crucible for both Catholic and socialist anti-Semitism. Although it's probably worth mentioning that when eventually the Austrian Rothschilds received reparations after the war, they insisted that the reparations should be used to pay, the restitution should be used to pay the pensions of all the people who had formerly worked in their forests. Or we might think of Walter Rathenau, an industrialist and aesthete who had been barred from serving as a reserve officer in the Prussian army because he was Jewish. You weren't allowed to serve as an officer if you were Jewish. Rathenau was famously ambivalent about being Jewish. When he eventually became Germany's first and only Jewish foreign minister in the aftermath of World War I, he left the form declaring his religion blank because he asserted it was no longer relevant. Certainly, he had known exactly what it meant for a Jew to buy the little Prussian royal palace of Freienwalde, which you see here, and restore it to something like its 18th century perfection. When the court asked him to return the Prussian crown that still stood atop its flagpole, he refused. So perhaps it's not surprising that Freienwalde, which had belonged to Queen Louisa, became a central theme in the anti-Semitic attacks upon Rathenau before his 1922 assassination, when the libelous rumour circulated that he had a sculpture above the gate of his Berlin mansion which featured the crowned heads of Europe in a sacrificial bowl. Now, this may seem to be a very German story, but it's worth noting that the mausoleum in which Rathenau was buried, which you see here, had been designed by Alfred Messel, whose brother owned Nymans, one of the English properties in our book, which you saw earlier. And in fact, Alfred Messel designed an earlier iteration of Nymans, although it was subsequently destroyed because the successors didn't like it. So collections like these are not a coincidence, but actually a feature of our book, just as they were a feature of the milieu it describes. Juliet.
Thank you. Sometimes these pan-European connections were familial. When Ferdinand de Rothschild was preparing to build Waddesdon, and this is a lovely detail, I think, from the exterior, he asked to know the heights above sea level of all the other Rothschild houses in the Vale of Aylesbury, Rothschildshire, as it's sometimes called. Mentmore, designed by Joseph Paxton of Crystal Palace fame, was the most spectacular of the houses with which other members of the family competed. And this competitive conversation between different houses in different places moves us quickly into Europe, to Ferrières, for example, near Paris, shown here in a print of around 1870, with hunting going on in its grounds and its aviary as well, and pheasant enclosure at the bottom. Ferrières was built by Ferdinand's great-uncle James, called by anti-Semites Rothschild I, King of the Jews, and like Mentmore, Ferrières was designed by Joseph Paxton. There were very private spaces at Ferrières. Opposite this smoking room we see on the slide, opposite it, there was a little oratory. And the French painter Eugène Lamy, who contributed to the decoration of the house, conjured it up as a place of private sociability in a wonderful series of watercolors. But it's the giganticist spectacle of a palace that really made it such a very public statement about the status of the Rothschilds. It is a sort of regal magnificence. Ferrières had a very different kind of posterity from Waddesdon. During the war, the Rothschilds were stripped of their French nationality, and the Nazis recognized Ferrières' emblematic nature when it was occupied by German troops and the works of art seized and sent to Bavaria. It's a very sad place now to visit, I think, officially an historical monument owned by the University of Paris, but rather desolate. in what one member of the Rothschild family called a sad, dreamless sleep. But I want to show you some of the other houses that the book encompasses as we follow our story of Jews and their country houses into waterside villas, agricultural estates, and semi-rural enclaves. There is even an American postscript that considers how Americans adopted some of those European archetypes, each with their particular European histories and connotations, and made their traditions their own. From Rhode Island cottages, for example, this is the beaches in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Jewish American poet Emma Lazarus spent the summers with her family, to Otto Kahn's Oheka Castle on Long Island, to Falling Water in Pennsylvania, famous the world over as a seminal work by Frank Lloyd Wright and built for the Pittsburgh department store millionaire Edgar Jonas Kaufman and his wife Liliane, who you see here on their terrace. But to give you a sense of the range of the European houses that make up the main matter of the book, this is Villa Carolus, the library, surely one of the loveliest libraries in the world, in Beaulieu-sur-Mer on the French Riviera, a turn-of-the-century reimagining of an ancient Greek villa built by the Jewish architect Emmanuel Pomeroli for Theodor Reinach, archaeologist, lawyer, politician, and prominent Dreyfusard. Carolus is a deeply erudite, private retreat, expressive of the humanist and Jewish ideals of its creator, who was the founder of French liberal Judaism. Here's a fountain that you encounter early on a visit to Carolus, and the floor of the library. Villa La Montesca in Umbria is at the center of a big estate and was built by an Italian liberal politician and agricultural reformer and his American wife, with an extraordinary array of styles, the cultural high points of the recently united nation of Italy, from the Pietra Serena arcades of the Brunelleschian Renaissance to flamboyantly Baroque illusionistic ceilings. There were botanical gardens, and under the aegis of Alice Franchetti, the house was a site of educational innovation when Maria Montessori set up a school there, and of the revival and teaching of traditional crafts. I love this photograph by Hélène of one of the looms, weaving looms. This, the Villa Liebermann, is the studio house and lakeside retreat of the German painter Max Liebermann on Lake Wannsee, just outside Berlin. Some of the stone surfaces. Liebermann died in 1935, and in 1940, his widow Martha was forced to sell the house to the German Reich. In 1943, she killed herself rather than be deported to Theresienstadt. Villa Tugendhat, overlooking Brno, is what is in what is now the Czech Republic, is one of the most famous buildings in the world. Mies van der Rohe's modernist masterpiece for one of the city's most prominent textile manufacturers. Amazingly, Hélène Binet had not photographed it before, and her response proved particularly revelatory. This is just one of many interiors. The new perspective of our book presents the house in, we hope, a surprising and refreshing way, as the culmination of a Habsburg chapter that follows the Royal Kaiser Ferdinand Northern Railway, built to link Vienna with the mines in the north, a great industrial leap forward in which Jewish entrepreneurs have played a major role, and which means the Villa Tugendhat is considered in the context of industry and luxury with other quite different houses, including the Rothschilds' palatial Schillersdorf seen here and the Gutmanns' remodeled Renaissance castle of Tobitschau. Politics comes in here too, as an aristocratic style was appropriate for Jews living in the Habsburg Empire, but ceased to be so once they found themselves living in the new Czechoslovak Republic. The Tugendhats' enjoyment of their extraordinary house, is a detail of a column, was brief. They were forced to emigrate when the Nazis closed in on Czechoslovakia, traveling in the opposite direction along the railway that would carry most of Brno's large Jewish population to their deaths. For obvious reasons, few remain of the many, many Jewish country houses that our project identified in Eastern Europe, partly a product of the Holocaust, but also the legacies of war and communism. And this is an image of just one of them from a Yizkor book commemorating Jewish communities lost in the Shoah. Trent Park, near Enfield in England, just outside London, links a Jewish country house in Britain with what was happening in Europe in a dark but captivating way. Sir Philip Sassoon, who you see all swanky in evening dress on the left, had turned an old house into the epitome of a particular idea of the English country house, but he died just before the war. And during the war, its country house atmosphere was key to a crucial intelligence gathering initiative when Britain's top-ranking Nazi prisoners of war were flattered by the aristocratic ambience and lulled into a false sense of security in its drawing rooms and parkland where they were imprisoned. Everything was bugged. The light fittings, the pictures, trees in the gardens, and the prisoners' talk was recorded by secret listeners in the basement, many of whom were German Jews. This is one of them, Eric Mark, who died only a few years ago. The secret listeners gathered thousands of pages of transcripts about military plans and codes and about the murder of Jews in camps and killing sites all over Europe. Eric Mark recalled, most of them liked to boast about how many Jews they had killed, which was tough for me to take, being a Jew. Trent Park is currently being turned into luxury flats, but with a museum telling its wartime story.
In Britain, of course, country houses remain important symbols of the national past, and the National Trust, which preserves so many, has contributed to that reality. What we do in our book is to try and write Jewishness back into their stories. There were, however, many others, like Eastcliff and Worth Park, which belong to the Sussex Montefiores, that have been lost to posterity. This is quite a complicated story, but I want to hone in on one example which is particularly emblematic. In the early 1970s, the Rothschild Palace of Mentmore, which we saw earlier, was the best preserved Victorian house in the country and boasted a collection that rivaled that of the Queen. But when Mentmore and its contents were offered to the nation at a knockdown price, the nation chose not to save it. Here you see a campaign poster by Save to try and save Mentmore for the nation. Now, 1973 was a difficult year for many reasons, and the economic and political crisis was likely the most compelling factor. Yet there was something chilling about the terms in which Duff Cooper, Viscount Norwich, made the case for Mentmore to the House of Lords. It is not in any way characteristic, he said. It is not typical. He meant it wasn't typically English. It represents the international banker's Jewish taste of the Rothschilds. But surely, my lords, it is not the worse for that. What we're discussing is the fact that we have superb works of art which infinitely transcend the narrow bounds of Englishness or of any other country. Great art belongs to the world. Our book aims to unpick the assumptions that underline this argument, both the anti-Semitic conception of Jewish taste and a sense that houses like Mentmore were cuckoos in the national nest. But it also reminds us of things, I think perhaps of Jews, as Jews we often forget, of the dream of belonging that preceded the Shoah, and of the many ways in which British and European Jewish history converged up to that moment, which marked a seismic break not just in the history of the Jews, but also in the relationship between Britain and the continent. All the houses we focus on in this book are open to the public. Most are easy to visit. Having spent much of the past 10 years talking to the staff and volunteers who work in them, we encourage you to do just that. And here you can see the Liebermann Villa and Strawberry Hill, one in Britain and one just outside Berlin. Thank you. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you again, Juliet and Abigail, for that fascinating insight into these extraordinary buildings, but also the lives and history and politics and social history behind them. I think that has certainly whetted my appetite for visiting as many of these as I can, and probably our audiences. Um, so I forgot to mention, but while Juliet and Abigail were speaking, if people could send in their questions onto the chat section of Zoom, that would be great. Otherwise, we can take in your questions now. But I thought we'd I've got a question for you both. Do you maybe we can start and then people, as I say, send in your questions on Zoom if you have questions, and we can go over to people who want to ask in a minute. But I wanted to ask both of you, do you think that the conspicuousness of the buildings was more about being visible, as Jews being visible, um, in a very assertive way, or was it about wanting to almost protect themselves, protect the owners against anti-Semitism? I was thinking very much of what you were saying about Ferrières, which I think, having looked at this chapter in the book, the owner had royal symbols. There were lots of royal symbols, French royal symbols, and also Venetian, Renaissance Venetian symbols. And it almost seems that it was um, an exaggerated way of proclaiming belonging. Was there a sense of trying to almost protect themselves, as I say, against anti-Semitism or attacks um, uh, of not belonging to the country? This, attack that Jews often get of not being loyal citizens.
With Ferrières, I think there is something really quite confrontational. It's not just royal symbols from lots of different historical works of art. There's actually places where sort of JR is treated a little bit like the monogram of Louis XIV and Louis XV and things. There's sort of, and crossed R's and things, if I remember right, kind of back to back. It's really bold. And James de Rothschild, this irony. I mean, I think it's not accidental, the regalness of it, and this anti-Semitic taunt about Rothschild the First, King of the Jews, Rothschild Premier. With Waddesdon, for example, as another Rothschild house, I've always felt there's a very great kind of cultural confidence. It's really, people often come to these houses and just assume without thinking that they're assimilative, that they're trying to sort of pretend to be something that's always been there, a kind of house, a quintessential English country house or a French country house. It's the more we look at them, a lot of that is really not true in the houses we study. There is something very consciously making themselves present and often sort of playing with cultural identities and historical tropes. Whether it's protective, I don't know, because as Abigail gives in that sort of awful, wonderful example of Frauenwalde, how that sort of boldness with this little royal house then becomes a real focus of anti-Semitism. It's used as one of the weapons against him. But do you want to say more, Abigail?
Well, I suppose I wanted to say that I think in general, we don't read these houses as sites of assimilation because I think, of course, wealth is always a protection, but it wasn't really possible for the Jews who owned these places to hide. But at the same time, I think you can't really generalize because that's the point we also make, that they're not all the same type of house. So a house like Ferrières, as I understand it, is an explicitly European cosmopolitan house which plays with different traditions from different famous buildings in different parts of Europe. But somewhere like the Villa Montesca on the cover plays with different national, high points of Italian national culture. So it's very much a national house, even if it's new. So, it's very possible for people to choose to say quite different things with their houses, but that doesn't mean to say that they they're necessarily hiding. I mean,
they're not hiding houses.
They're not hiding because they can't.
Mm. Mm. Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions that have come in from our audience. So let's go to Barbara Elton, who has a very interesting question about the how the Jewish story is presented by the National Trust and perhaps other trust bodies. Um, can we go to Barbara? Would you like to ask your question, Barbara, to Juliet and Abigail?
Yes, I have the sense that sometimes the National Trust writes the Jewish story out of some of their houses. And I wondered if you thought this was a fair comment. I was particularly thinking of Upton House, which I visited about 20 years ago, where there was a very definite Jewish story told. And a friend of mine who visited much more recently said it had been erased. And I wondered if
we very much hope that this initiative has rather de-erased it again.
It's interesting that your friends thought. I mean, I've only ever encountered people who visited Upton who have found the story absent. But I think more recently, volunteers, because we held a conference partly there, and a lot of work was done to help the volunteers understand it better. So I think Upton is working towards telling that story better. But I agree with you that often it's a story which hasn't been told. For instance, I was very surprised when we first started working with Hughenden that their position was Disraeli's Jewishness was everywhere but nowhere at Hughenden, but now it's become a kind of core part of their narrative. So it's partly, often people who work in these properties are not very, it's just, first of all, there isn't an obvious story to tell, which is as established as the story of the family and the land, which we have for kind of a house like Chatsworth. And secondly, they often don't necessarily have expertise in Jewish history, so it can be helpful to contextualize the story differently.
I felt one of the contrast. Sorry, I was just going to say I thought there was a bit of a contrast between the National Trust's admirable attempt to reposition slavery stories within their properties, which I think is great, and that not happening with Jewish stories.
Well, we hope it is more now. I mean, one of the things that we're particularly proud of in the wider project to which this book is related, the Jewish Country Houses Research Project, is we provided training for a lot of the staff. I mean, it's not just the volunteers and the guides, also the staff and the marketing departments and people in these National Trust houses, Waddesdon, Hughenden, I mean, lots of them. And some houses have embraced it really fast and well. I mean, there have been amazing changes in the interpretation at Item Moat, for example, and Hughenden as well. So I think it's partly a question of giving some of the guides and volunteers just confidence to know what language to use, not to be frightened of using the word Jew or Jewish, or know these awful euphemisms they used to say rather embarrassedly, about Jewish origins or Jewish heritage or cosmopolitan, all these things. So it's partly educating people who are a bit nervous and don't want to offend, and also just helping them understand the stories and the context. And it's just a layer. It's often just a layer of the history of these houses that's added, and then people can embrace it as more or less depending on their own interest.
Yeah, I'm very excited actually to see. So now that we've started working with these houses, I'm really excited to see how, having visited Upton with the conference and seeing how the potential that's there, I'm very excited to see how that's going to develop now that the property are really keen on it.
Thank you, Barbara.
Watch this space. We hope you'll be happier with what you see.
Interesting question. Actually, Linda has asked, do the houses have mezuzahs, any of them? Interesting.
Well, some of them did. Obviously, I don't know whether Linda's house has a mezuzah, so I think these things are varied. But for example, Worth Park, which belonged to the Sussex Montefiores, had a mezuzah in every room. And this was commented on by Augustus Hare when he visited. So some of them did. I'm sure Eastcliff Lodge did, but there will have been other houses which didn't. You know, well, I'm sure Freienwalde didn't, so it will vary.
And Waddesdon, for example, Waddesdon, as far as we know, didn't. But Ferdinand's sister, Alice, who had a little pavilion elsewhere on the estate, she did. So it is case by case.
Okay. We've got a question from Barbara and Anthony Nichols. Also, if we can go to Barbara and Anthony asking about the design of the houses.
Well, the question is really how much input the owners of the house. I mean, is it someone that was very rich just said to a designer, build me a house with beautiful things? Or I mean, how much? What was the inputs that they had?
It would vary, but many of the houses, the owners are deeply involved in the design process. And I mean, almost always a patron would be heavily involved with decisions about a house. But there are many examples of the owners we know being very closely involved.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a question from Joe Goldblatt about plaques on houses. Can we go to Joe?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for such a fascinating study of these beautiful homes and the Jewish influence. In Edinburgh, a few years ago, I tried to have a historic plaque put on the home of a former legendary rabbi in our city, long deceased. As you do, I wrote a letter to the current owners, and they wrote back and they said, you could put the plaque on the back door, but not in the front of the house. So then I decided to do some research, and I found that if you have a historic plaque on a house in the United Kingdom, your property value may indeed go up, increase. So I thought I would make that argument. I wrote to them a second time and said, what do you think now? They never replied to my letter. So my question is, what is the economic impact of these homes when a Jewish family has resided there? Is there any research done on, are they difficult to sell? Are they more valuable, less valuable than other homes? What's the rest of the story?
I'm not sure that, I mean, I think a lot of them might be difficult to sell for other reasons. The ones we look at are so large and difficult to use that I'm not sure that's the main criterion. I mean, Juliet, you may have.
No, I'm afraid I really don't know. I mean, so the houses that we focus on, they're all mostly in the public domain in some way. You know, they're sort of publicly owned, or but yeah, I don't know, I'm afraid.
My instinct is that different families will have different cachets.
Yes.
A Rothschild house might be rather glamorous.
Yes.
But maybe the house of a family you've never heard of would not have the same allure.
Yes.
And do you know if indeed it is true that if you have a historic plaque on a home, that it is likely the value may increase? Or is it based on individual houses?
Well, I'm sure some. I mean, I know that people who live in John Constable's house in Hampstead always boast about living there. So I'm sure that helps with the value. And Dickens's houses, so I'm sure there's one in Highgate. You know, they're very. But I mean, as Abigail says, it very much depends on the person. You know, whether it has a cachet and a prestige, or whether it's someone perfectly horrible that you don't want to be living in the household.
Good luck.
It's a very interesting question for English Heritage, or Historic England as it's called now. They're in charge of the blue plaques. I'm sure they could tell you interesting things about it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, we'll go on to Liz Cashton, who has an interesting question about slavery, connections to slavery. Liz. Hello, Liz.
Hi. It seems to me that some of the Jewish families may well have been caught up in making their money in the West Indies, like the non-Jewish English families. And I wonder if you know, or you came across any instances in which the Jewish families who put their money into the houses had made some of that money out of the slave trade or slavery.
So the issue here is about chronology. So it wasn't until 1831 that Jews could probably own freehold property. And in fact, Jews couldn't enter the House of Commons until the late 1840s. And they didn't enter the House of Lords until the 1880s. So Sephardic families who made their money in the West Indies, who bought country houses, basically converted. So they ceased then to be Jewish country houses, if you see what I mean. So for example, Manasseh Lopez, who bought a house called Maristow in Devon, had to convert. He became an MP. He bought the house, converted, and became an MP kind of together. So it was a decision, and his heir was then not bar mitzvah and also baptized. So it was a kind of family decision to leave Jewishness, and the whole family had then, a kind of dynasty of MPs in the Southwest. So this was a family which made a lot of money in the West Indies, but they were no longer Jewish. If you look, then there's another house, the other house which has the strongest links really is the Lusada House in Sidmouth, Peak House. And this is the only house where the owner was a Jew who also appears on the Register of Compensated Slaveholders in the West Indies, which has been put together at UCL. And in fact, the owner, the family were a family which had roots in the West Indies, but the owner only came into his West Indian states the year before the Emancipation Act. So in practice, the wealth didn't necessarily feed directly into the house, because he came into the wealth to those estates. There's a kind of generational lapse, but that's really the only example where the families, and in fact, his heir was not Jewish either. So it's a kind of pivot point, because he was the second provincial sheriff who was a Jew in England. So in that sense, he was a figure in the emancipation of the Jews story. But at the same time, the family died out. His heir married another relative who'd also been Jewish, but they married in a church near Cheltenham, if I remember correctly. So the real point here is chronological. We tell the story of houses which were part of the campaign for Jewish emancipation, and then the consequences of that story, whereas the periodization of the West Indian slave trade basically predates that in Britain. Although, of course, if you wanted to go to the West Indies, you would find many such houses. And in fact, there's an article by someone called Laura Leibman who talks about that. So it would be a different story over there, where landholding law was different.
Yeah, and that's mainly about Dutch owned.
No, there would have been also in the British colonies, but the point is that this statute, which made it difficult for Jews to own land, was a medieval English statute of a particular kind, which had never been repealed, but obviously it didn't apply in the West Indies.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you, Abigail. Let's just see if there are any other questions that have come in. We've got one by Benjamin Carey.
That's my brother.
I thought there might be a connection there. Benjamin,
good evening, sister.
Hello.
I'm always interested in how research changes personal perspectives. How has your sort of view changed and evolved as you've done this research? And what was the most surprising thing you came across?
Sorry, what do you mean?
How has your concept of the Jewish country house evolved through what you've learned?
Well, we've just learned and learned and learned.
No, I think it's become more plural.
Yes, yes.
So we started off with a conference which was called the Jewish Country House, but now we're very clear that we talk about Jewish country houses.
Yeah. Yes.
And we're not trying to, I think it's difficult because the English country house is obviously an ideal type. and also a social institution. So I suppose my view is that the Jewish country house was a socio-cultural phenomenon at a particular time, but from an, you know, at the same time, I don't think Jewish country houses represent an ideal type.
No, and I think I've been amazed just by how many there are. I mean, and how deeply interconnected. So, you know, there were hundreds in, you know, in Poland, Ukraine. I mean, every conference we've been to, we've had this series of incredible conferences, and it is just, I've just found it quite extraordinary how many there were and how various they were and how interconnected they were. Yeah, plural. I mean, in sheer amount, plural and variety. And also people. I think the thing that hasn't changed, though I've become increasingly irritated by it, is still the first assumption. Often when we talk about the project before people have read the book or have learned about it, this assumption that what we're doing is looking for a kind of quintessential, I mean, it's a rather racist idea, this sort of quintessential, you know, essence of Jewish country houseness, you know, the idea that we're trying to look for some common feature, you know, a telltale sign in a house. And for all, I suppose, the more and more work we've done, the less and less illegitimate that seems, but it remains amongst some people the first assumption of what our job is to tell you how can you tell a Jewish country house by looking at it, which you can't. I can tell you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to see you.
Your book goes up to where you take in Falling Water in the States and Mies van der Rohe in Europe, some modernist architects. Is there a contemporary equivalent of this kind of a phenomena? I mean, I'm kind of thinking of Russian oligarchs who maybe
yes, no, mate, we talked a bit, you know, we didn't put them in, but we did talk about whether there was. I think if there is, it would be in the Russian oligarch department. That would be something.
But I think the thing is that, from my point of view, because I'm not a country houses historian, I'm just a Jewish historian. From my point of view, what's important about this phenomenon is centrally connected to the place of the country house in European political and social hierarchies at a particular time. And it just doesn't have that place anymore. So, of course, there are going to be lots of oligarchs. I mean, you know, people are always telling me, Robert Maxwell, for example, had a house, wasn't it Headington Hall with some kind of Jewish art in it?
Elias doing something.
And, you know, or oligarch houses, I'm sure there are lots of them, and they might have similar themes, but it's not to say that oligarch money isn't powerful and political, but it's not political in a way which is connected to the land. That said, I think there is one house which we could have talked about, which would have, but I mean, I haven't been able to visit it. So Robert Whaley Cohen had a house on Hampstead Heath, Kenwood Towers, which is now owned by a Jewish oligarch. I think he's sanctioned, actually. I forget his name.
Yes, he is.
So, you know, it would be interesting to know, he restored the house, Athlone House. Whether he was interested in its Jewish history, this we don't know.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe room for a volume 2, looking into contemporary houses. But I think we'll begin to draw this to a close now. There's a few questions which have come up that I'll ask you. We've had similar queries on. So firstly, is your book, or will your book be available as a paperback anytime soon?
We've no idea. That's up to the publisher.
Yes.
But what I would say is it's very good value for a book like that.
It is. It's very good value. Yes. Very good value, everybody.
It's a beautiful,
and quite cheap on Amazon, I think. Amazon.
Yeah, it's something like £35. You can buy lots of paperbacks for £35.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And we've also got questions about, is there a market for touring Jewish country houses? We actually did some with Jewish Renaissance a few years ago, and I think we are planning on more. Gita in Manchester has asked any chance of a JR trip to Tugendhat. which is a great idea. So yeah, please send in.
Well, there are several Jewish villas in Brno, so there's something to visit there.
Okay.
And lots of people do ask us this. So I think the answer is yes, there is a market. How to?
It's not for us to take forward.
Yeah.
So a subject rich for exploring, which is something we can definitely do. Okay, I think as we've come to the end of our session, so let me thank you both very much for giving us this great insight tonight into the houses, as I say, and it's certainly created much interest and whetted our appetites. Okay, someone's asked about Oxford. Are there Jewish themed tours in Oxford? Okay, well,
Oh yes, wow.
There are. I think that's right.
Okay,
There are.
well,
I think there might be a leaflet you can download. There certainly are, and I would also flag Rebecca Abrams' excellent Jewish journey through the Ashmolean.
yes, well said. Okay, well, perhaps we can forward any particular queries to you both if we get specific questions. Okay, thank you, everybody. Also, if you want to read more on this topic, we have an excellent article by Matthew Rice in the current edition of Jewish Renaissance, where he reviews the book and discusses the wider issues it raises.
Okay.
And yes, to see that, if you don't subscribe already, this is our latest issue, please go to our website and you can become a subscriber on www.jewishrenaissance.org.uk. I've got two more things just before we go to flag up. So at Jewish Renaissance, we have events online and events in person, and all of our events can be booked on the events section of our website. So first of all, want to let you know about on Tuesday, the 25th of February next week at 7:30, we've got an online event looking at the art of Maurice Sendak. So this is about the author and illustrator Maurice Sendak, who's best known for his children's book, Where the Wild Things Are. But he had a long and celebrated career in addition to that. And the event next week is to mark 50 years since an animated Sendak TV special aired on CBS with Carole King voicing the title character. And we'll be marking that moment and also the illustrations and the life of Maurice Sendak with the artist and educator Irene Wise. She'll be tracing Sendak's diverse and surprising influences. And the other thing I'd like to flag up is one of our in-person events, which will be on Tuesday, the 25th of March, when we'll be taking a group of JR readers to visit the Barbican. And we've got the best seats in the house. We'll be watching the Britten Sinfonia perform 1945, A Kind of Haunting, which is a new work exploring the legacy of the Holocaust by composer Michael Zev Gordon. And afterwards, we've got an exclusive talk with the composer and other performers. So, as I say, you can get all the information about that and you can book on the events section on our website. And all that's left for me to do now is to thank you again, Abigail and Juliet, for a really fascinating evening. And thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. Goodbye.
Bravo, bravo.
Thank you.
Bravo.